Today, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky traveled to Turkey to meet with President Erdogan in a bid to revive peace efforts.
Slava Ukraine!
A new development has emerged in the midst of a rapidly intensifying diplomatic landscape. While major powers exchange proposals and warnings across negotiating tables, one country has begun reshaping the situation on the ground in a far more subtle way: Turkey. Publicly, Ankara continues to emphasize the need for dialogue and a stable long-term settlement in the ongoing conflict. Yet behind this diplomatic posture, Turkey has initiated a quiet but highly effective maritime strategy, one that places significant pressure on Russia's logistical routes in the Black Sea. The first signal of this shift appeared unexpectedly. A Russian cruise ship carrying more than 600 passengers approached Istanbul's Galata port, only to be denied permission to dock. After hours of waiting, the vessel was forced to abandon its planned route and return toward the Russian coastline. What appeared at first glance to be a bureaucratic hiccup had deeper roots. Just days earlier, a Turkish Ro-Pax ferry had been held outside the port of Sochi for more than 3 days due to prolonged Russian security inspections. Divers carried out extended underwater checks around the port's infrastructure, measures that reflected Russia's growing fear of maritime drone attacks. The Turkish ship became entangled not because of suspicion against its crew, but because of Russia's broader anxiety over the vulnerability of its coastal facilities. Turkey took note, and its response became immediately visible at its own ports. If Turkish vessels could face delays and restrictions, so could Russian ones. But this exchange of signals at sea was only the beginning of a more consequential confrontation, when trade routes become targets. The true turning point in this emerging tension came soon after, when a Turkish-flagged LNG tanker was struck during a Russian drone attack while docked at a Ukrainian port. This incident crossed a significant threshold. It demonstrated that commercial shipping, including vessels belonging to NATO member states, was increasingly exposed to the risks of the broader regional conflict. 16 Turkish crew members suddenly found themselves at the center of an attack that had nothing to do with them personally, and everything to do with Russia's effort to disrupt Ukraine's maritime export routes. The strike signaled that Russia was willing to hit infrastructure and commercial corridors that many countries rely on, not just Ukraine. This is where Turkey's role becomes particularly significant. Large volumes of Russian oil move through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles via what has become known as the Shadow Fleet, a network of aging, minimally insured tankers used to bypass sanctions and transport energy to global markets. These ships depend entirely on Turkey's control of the straits. If Ankara chose to intensify inspections, enforce stricter documentation rules, or increase scrutiny of vessels with uncertain insurance status, Russia's export system could slow dramatically. A single extended inspection means delays worth millions. A pattern of such inspections could become a powerful strategic instrument. This is the backdrop for the current shift. Security incidents at Ukrainian ports, strained diplomatic exchanges, and rising concerns over maritime safety have pushed Turkey and Russia into a new, more fragile phase of their relationship. What started as a dispute over port access is now developing into a far wider challenge, one that affects trade routes, energy flows, and the balance of power in the Black Sea. How Turkey holds a critical leverage point. While the incident with the LNG tanker elevated tensions, another factor quietly amplified Turkey's influence: its legal authority over the straits. Under the Montreux Convention, Turkey has broad rights to regulate the passage of vessels between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, especially when security concerns are involved. For Russia, these waterways form the essential artery linking its Black Sea ports to global markets. Each day, tankers carrying millions of barrels of oil pass through the Bosphorus. Any delay, even measured in hours, disrupts shipment schedules, reduces revenue, and complicates Russia's attempts to maintain energy flows during wartime sanctions. This is why Turkey's position is so pivotal. If Ankara were to apply the strictest possible interpretation of safety and environmental provisions, the entire Shadow Fleet could find itself slowed, inspected, or even turned back. And because many of these tankers operate with unclear insurance coverage or outdated technical records, the criteria for additional scrutiny are already present. Even hypothetical scenarios illustrate the stakes. A 48-hour inspection of a single tanker could cost Russia millions in delayed exports. A 72-hour hold across multiple vessels could create bottlenecks stretching back to Russian ports. Any decision to deny passage to uninsured ships could temporarily freeze entire segments of Russia's maritime trade. These possibilities are not theoretical for policymakers in Moscow. They understand that Turkey's actions, even when framed strictly within legal norms, can reshape the pace and flow of exports that Russia depends on. At the same time, Turkey's growing energy cooperation with Western partners, including expanded LNG arrangements, has reduced the vulnerability that once limited its ability to act independently. Where Turkey once worried about over-reliance on Russian gas, it now has multiple alternatives. These developments have fundamentally altered the balance of leverage across the Black Sea. Turkey no longer needs to avoid confrontation out of economic dependence, and Russia can no longer assume uninterrupted access to maritime corridors. A shifting diplomatic map. While maritime tensions escalated quietly at sea, a parallel shift was unfolding in the diplomatic arena. In recent months, Turkey has taken a more assertive role in international discussions relating to the conflict, particularly regarding Crimea. At a major international summit, Turkey's representatives voiced strong support for the principle that Crimea's status should be resolved within the framework of international law. This was notable because Turkey has often attempted to balance its ties with both Ukraine and Russia. But this time, the language was clearer and more forward-leaning than many had expected. The significance of this speech grew further when, on the same day, over 50 countries endorsed a declaration calling for stronger enforcement of sanctions and increased pressure on networks that help Russia circumvent them. The document emphasized three key components, targeting intermediaries and shell companies used to move restricted goods or fund flows through third countries. Increasing restrictions on maritime transport, including measures aimed at vessels that attempt to disguise their origins or cargo. Expanding limits on Russian energy exports, not only oil and gas, but also LNG and nuclear-related materials. Turkey, as a signatory, suddenly found itself aligned with a broader coalition taking a firmer stance than before. Given Turkey's special jurisdiction over the straits, its involvement made these measures far more consequential. This alignment was particularly striking because it placed Turkey in a position where its maritime authority intersected with a global sanctions framework. In other words, the political and economic dimensions of the conflict were converging, and Turkey stood at their intersection. For Russia, this combination of diplomatic movement and maritime pressure created a new strategic challenge. The situation was no longer just about individual incidents at sea. Instead, it reflected a broader shift in how regional powers were responding to the conflict, the expanding reach of maritime pressure. As the diplomatic landscape tightened, the practical consequences at sea became even more apparent. The global declaration against sanction evasion didn't only target banks or trade intermediaries. It directly influenced how ports, insurers, and maritime authorities across the world interacted with vessels linked to Russia. For ships that rely on discrete ownership structures or opaque cargo documentation, the risks multiplied. Ports across multiple regions began requiring additional verification, and insurers grew increasingly cautious about underwriting older tankers associated with high-risk routes. Many of the vessels in Russia's shadow fleet fall into precisely these categories. This shift has immediate implications. Ships without internationally recognized insurance may be refused entry into major ports. Cargoes transported through gray channels could lose access to financial clearing systems. Tankers attempting to obscure their identity risk being excluded from supply chains altogether. For Russia, whose economy depends heavily on maritime exports, even a partial slowdown can be deeply disruptive. And with Turkey controlling the primary gateway between the Black Sea and the wider world, its decisions weigh heavily. Turkey's signature on the declaration also grants it stronger legitimacy when it chooses to inspect, delay, or question vessels operating on the edge of regulatory compliance. While Ankara may present its actions strictly as safety measures, the cumulative effect is unmistakable. Russia's logistical routes face increasing friction. This doesn't necessarily mean Turkey is seeking direct confrontation. Rather, Turkey is using the tools available to assert its national interests while reinforcing its position in regional security. But for Moscow, the outcome feels the same. Its access to maritime corridors is becoming narrower and more uncertain. At the same time, Turkey's own energy diversification continues to reshape its strategic environment. Long-term LNG agreements and expanded storage capacity reduce the leverage that Russia once held. And as Turkey's dependency lessens, its willingness to act more independently increases. These developments collectively signal a long-term shift in the Black Sea's maritime dynamics, where regulatory enforcement, economic interests, and geopolitical considerations converge. Crimea and the military dimension. The diplomatic and economic pressures surrounding Russia's maritime networks were unfolding in parallel with significant developments on the military front, particularly in Crimea. In the weeks following the major UN summit, a series of attacks targeted Russian military infrastructure on the peninsula. Many of these strikes were precise, coordinated, and aimed at high-value assets. Satellite imagery later showed that a notable portion of Russia's Black Sea fleet had been damaged or forced to relocate. Some of Russia's most important air assets, including fighter bombers, were moved from Crimean bases to airfields deeper inside Russian territory. Analysts describe this not as a tactical redeployment, but as an urgent response to vulnerabilities that Russia could not easily address. For Ukraine, this shift represented a major opportunity. For Russia, it marked a new strategic challenge, sustaining a military presence in Crimea while contending with ongoing threats to air bases, naval facilities, and logistical routes. Turkey's diplomatic position, emphasizing international law and the importance of stability in the Black Sea, indirectly reinforced the legitimacy of increased international scrutiny over Crimea. While Turkey did not direct military operations, its stance provided political space for actions that reshaped the peninsula's security landscape. This period also saw the collapse of Russia's long-standing grain transit leverage. For months, global food prices had been influenced by Russia's interruptions of Ukraine's grain corridors. But as the security environment changed, ships from Ukrainian ports gradually resumed movement under the quiet but meaningful presence of Turkish naval oversight. Turkey's role transitioned from mediator to stabilizing actor. Ships leaving Ukrainian harbors now operated with increased confidence that the Black Sea's maritime pathways were backed not by neutrality alone, but by an active commitment to maintaining safe passage. Meanwhile, Russia's own options narrowed. Its naval mobility in Crimea was increasingly constrained. Its grain leverage weakened. Its primary exit from the Black Sea, the Turkish Straits, remained under heightened scrutiny. The combined effect was a shift in momentum that neither side had fully anticipated at the start of the year. And as winter approached, the implications for energy security, trade flows, and regional stability became even more significant. The collapse of Russia's strategic assumptions. For years, Russia operated under the belief that the Black Sea was a relatively secure domain, one where its navy could maneuver freely and where nearby states would avoid direct escalation. Turkey, in particular, was viewed by Moscow as a pragmatic partner that depended heavily on Russian energy and would therefore avoid any measure that could jeopardize trade. But this period has revealed how quickly the foundations of that assumption can shift. Several elements contributed to this unexpected reversal. 1. Turkey's diversified energy strategy. Long-term LNG contracts and increased cooperation with Western energy suppliers gave Ankara room to maneuver. The fear of sudden cutoffs, once a significant constraint, has faded. 2. Russia's maritime exposure. The reliance on an aging shadow fleet created systemic vulnerabilities. These tankers are more susceptible to inspections, insurance complications, and regulatory barriers, all areas where Turkey holds influence. 3. Crimea's military risks. Russia's challenges on the peninsula demonstrated that even heavily fortified positions could be pressured in ways that force retreats and relocations. 4. Global coordination. The multi-country declaration against sanction circumvention created an international environment where unilateral actions by Turkey suddenly carried broader legitimacy. Together, these factors formed a strategic environment that Moscow had not fully anticipated. Turkey did not need to directly challenge Russia. It simply needed to enforce existing rules and international norms. The consequences emerged naturally from the situation. The Black Sea, once a stable passageway for Russian military and commercial vessels, has become a complicated space where safety checks, insurance demands, and diplomatic signals all play decisive roles. The developments across diplomacy, maritime strategy, and regional security reveal a clear shift in the balance of power around the Black Sea. What began as isolated incidents at sea evolved into a broader strategic recalibration, one where Turkey emerged with far greater leverage than many expected, and Russia faced a series of constraints it had not fully anticipated. Turkey's diversified energy partnerships, increased enforcement of maritime regulations, and stronger alignment with international norms have transformed the dynamics of the region. At the same time, Russia's reliance on aging tankers, vulnerable supply routes, and strained logistics has reduced its freedom of action. The result is a new strategic environment where influence is shaped not only by military assets, but by control of trade corridors, diplomatic positioning, and the ability to enforce maritime rules. As long as these pressures continue to overlap, legal, economic, and security-related, the Black Sea will remain one of the most consequential regions for global geopolitics, and Turkey's decisions will continue to play a central role in determining how events unfold. For more clear and in-depth geopolitical analysis, make sure to subscribe to MGE.